My name is Stephanie Ybarra, and I'm really excited to get into this conversation, especially given the wonderful thoughts and ideas that have been shared thus far about public spaces. And art has already come up, obviously, a lot, but we're going to iris in even further and let art in public spaces and art making in public spaces be the focus of the next hour or so. As I was listening to the other, the keynote speakers and the other panelists up on stage today, was really struck by how lucky I am to be living in New York City and be part of a community that has just a multitude of public spaces. And when we talk about words, we use words like safe and joyful and democratic. Those words really resonate with me in terms of what I associate with public spaces and art in public spaces. And then I started to imagine what a world would look like without that, what my community would look like without those spaces. And that's where I thought we might begin our conversation today. So I want to start with my friend over here on the right, Konstantine. We've been talking a little bit this morning about your work as it relates to the reclamation of public spaces by way of art. So you have looked a lot at communities that have been destroyed or taken over and are no longer have the kind of availability of public spaces that we are aspiring to. So can you talk a little bit about what that means to take back space by way of art?
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, well, as you pointed out, my work has been very much on Beirut and Lebanon and the role of public space there and the way particularly young people are trying to reclaim those spaces in the wake of the civil war. And in many ways, I think my trajectory in looking at Beirut over 15 years can mirror some of the discussions we've already had on public space, and maybe I can try and add to it. Because one of the first questions I was asking myself, being there, was how do you reconcile a society that's gone through 15 years of civil war, where the public spaces, the boulevards, the squares were the front lines of the fighting, where the state is basically governed and dominated by the leaders of the warring factions, and where the city center is completely razed and rebuilt by a private developer whose primary interest is real estate development and financial return primarily. And so what then constitutes the common, what constitutes the shared space, what are the elements that start to make it possible to live, to coexist again after having fought each other. Well, I found that maybe in many ways the public space didn't necessarily have to look the way we expected to look. It wasn't necessarily going to be the square or the boulevard. Maybe it was the street in the neighborhood, tucked away in maybe what are kind of in a fragmented city. Many people would say those are not public spaces precisely because they are governed by those militias, that the rules are there. There's heavy-handed order that dominates those spaces that makes it impossible for something else to emerge, and that effectively that's the way the city is organized, but also split apart. And so what I've been looking at more recently is the way young people who have not experienced pre-war Beirut are now trying to reclaim an idea of what publicity means. And art definitely has featured and has been mobilized in the way they try to reclaim those spaces. In my experience, the question of safe space is crucial. The idea of openness is very difficult in a city as polarized as Beirut. So youth revert to those safe spaces where they can actually safely be open to each other. And they create opportunities and actually a new geography in the city that starts to, I think, develop a new script for the city and for what it means to be in public in the city. And art actually plays that role in kind of providing a narrative and providing a kind of a different reality, if you like, a different platform where that other way of being in the city can exist.
When we're talking about youth and reshaping a narrative, I can't help but think, Stavros, about the work that you do with your students in using cinema and film to capture disused public spaces and document them, archive them, and actually use the archival footage to make art in and of itself. And we were talking a little bit about the impact that has on your students as this next generation contemplates the design of public spaces and makes inherent in them the receiving art. Can you shed a little bit of light on how you're molding young minds?
Yes, I'm only glad to do so, but and thank you very much for asking. But let me just connect to what Konstantine very nicely and very eloquently said about conflict and the city. It's very interesting how the city is portrayed in the arts, or used to be portrayed in the arts, as a battleground. Especially cinema and literature thrive on these depictions of the city, or these representations of the city, these bleak reconstructions of the city. It takes only 5 minutes of a film by Eisenstein to understand how this can be interpreted literally. But other reconstructions of the city in literature and cinema in particular are also not very generous with the phenomenon of the city. And the city is portrayed as evil, as corrupted, as chaotic, and all these things. So it's interesting how the city, which is a work of art in itself, and sometimes it takes us only to walk along a street to enjoy this work of art. And actually there's a lot of literature in the art of taking a walk that goes back to urban flânery from the 19th century, and at a time when the city was more exciting and probably not safer, but richer in experiences. So back to education and research, which of course they're two different discourses, but it feels as if I'm wearing the same hat, actually. It's not that difficult to differentiate between the two. I think it was Deborah who said before that art is a refuge, and it's a beautiful metaphor, and I would like to think of that more often. It's not easy all the time. But we use art in education as well in order to do different things. The first thing that pops into mind is that art helps us understand the phenomenon of the city in ways that we couldn't do before. The city is a complex phenomenon. It is in constant flux. It changes all the time. There is fragmentation, there is simultaneity, and the tools out there need to be resharpened every now and then. And cinema, in particular, has been very helpful in our efforts as architects to understand the urban environment. As I said earlier in an informal discussion we had just outside, even the act of framing the city, the act of framing architecture, generates a whole process of thinking what you have to eliminate from your frame, what you have to include. And this is a very interesting analytical process that we need in architecture and city planning to understand, come to terms with the phenomenon of the city. But this is not only this is not the only way of using, obviously, cinema in architectural studies nowadays. Our students use cinema as a way of, as a poetic contemplation upon the phenomenon of the city. Reflection, but not with words, but with images, and how these images can generate a discussion about potential futures for the city, which is the third, I think, most obvious function of the arts in the architectural studies, how you can imagine a future for your city without actually using any of the traditional mediums that we have ready in our tool set, like drawing or 3D, wonderful 3D representation. So cinema is really very helpful, and this is the way we are trying to use it. On the other hand, you have the actual process of design, these young people designing urban spaces, and there is, of course, a desire to make these urban spaces work, livable, inviting to people, to all people. And the way to do that, I mean, there are obviously many ways to do that, and one which I find very particular, and many presentations in the morning were helpful in making this more clear in my mind, is that conflict in the cities can be a creative force. And I'm picking on from something we saw in This is Reading. Public spaces are about crossing, intersections, crossroads. And yes, indeed, you have to have people out there, not really standing side by side, acknowledging each other's existence, but colliding with one another, knowing fresh, knowing for the first time your neighbor. There is friction there. Where there is friction, there is energy. Energy is entropy, and we want this in a public space. And this is probably, I think, a good advice for young designers who want to create livable public spaces. Keep the conflict there, make it something creative for the future of the city, get people involved, make them part of the narrative, which is not a dominant narrative anymore. It's something more multifaceted, more engaging.
I'm so glad that you brought up the role of conflict, and I want to come back to that. But since you invoked Lynn's piece, This is Reading, Lynn, I'm curious to hear from you how, as a generative artist, how your process shifts when you talk about making art for a public space and with a community, or and telling the story of a city, and how does your sort of creative process differ from, as you would normally sort of write your normal plays?
Primarily, I'm a playwright, and I'm very accustomed to making art in spaces like this for prosceniums. And so entering to Reading, it was really my first kind of intervention in which I was asked to go outside of my comfort zone, which I found very exciting. And over the last few years, I've been teaching a course called American Spectacle, which is looking at theater beyond the proscenium and encouraging all of my students to step outside of their comfort zones while I didn't. And I was really transformed really by my engagement with the city. I was brought to Reading, as I mentioned earlier, because of an email that I received from a friend, but also in addition, I received a commission from a theater called the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, which specifically was asking American playwrights to write about American revolutions and to think much more expansively than we're used to thinking, to make plays that were big, to make plays that were reaching out to diverse audiences. And I decided that the revolution that I wanted to focus on was the de-industrial revolution, because it was really changing the American landscape in ways that I felt like we hadn't really begun to articulate in an artistic way. And so when I entered Reading, I asked questions, and the first question that I asked was, how would you define your city? And people always said, Reading was. And as a storyteller, I found that really fascinating, that they couldn't articulate a present tense or a future tense. And so it was a city really with an absence of a narrative. The next thing that I found is I began walking around downtown and noticed that there were all of these empty spaces. And I realized it's not only a city that has no narrative, it's a city that's also defined by the absence of people and spaces. And you talk about nexus points, is that downtown traditionally in these small cities have been the nexus points for folks, and where people intersect and where people collide. And I thought people are no longer colliding in these communities, which means that they're not engaging in conversations. And as a result, I thought, how do I make art for people who don't have spaces where they can go? How do I make art also for people in Reading who are not used to crossing the threshold into traditional artistic spaces? Because one of the things when I spoke to people, I said, do you go to the theater? The answer was no. Do you go to museums? The answer was no. Have you ever been in a museum? For the majority of people who I encountered, the majority had never been in a museum. And I asked why. They said, we're scared. We don't know what to wear when we go to the theater. We don't know what to wear when we go into a museum. And as a result, they chose not to engage with art at all. And so the challenge was, how do you create theater and storytelling for people who are afraid to enter into the institutions that traditionally house your stories? And that's how we came up with this performance installation. And we very specifically wanted to house it in a space that was iconic, a space that had been the nexus point for the community, and that was the railroad station, which closed in Reading in 1981. And with the closing of the railroad, it really stifled the life of the city. And we thought, how do you bring life back to a city that's been stifled? Is you open the space that symbolically was that nexus point. And so that's how I came to do this installation. And we haven't completed it yet. We go up in July 14th, so I find it exciting. I find that as an artist who has spent the majority of my career working in very big regional theaters or New York theaters, that the challenge today, particularly because our culture is so fractured, is figuring out a way to take the stories to people who need to hear them, and to sort of erase those barriers so that we can interact. Like what I would define as one of our successes with this installation is if we can get the mayor of Reading to stand side by side with a homeless man, both of them look at the images and recognize that they share the same narrative.
So we'll see you all in Reading, Pennsylvania later in July, I'm sure. And I love that you're talking about this. You know, This Is Reading is a project of an artist saying we need to get outside of the walls of our cultural institutions in order to extend the invitation to a broader audience. And Limor, we've already spoken a little bit about how your role at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York is not the opposite, but it is to contemplate how an institution, massive institutions like the Met, redefines itself and reactivates its own spaces in order to extend the most capacious invitation possible to its community. And so you've done that by way of blending artistic mediums inside of the Met. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the opportunities and the unique challenges associated with that kind of task, that assignment inside of a cultural institution.
Thank you. My place or space or agora is far from neutral. It's a place that's filled with objects from all of time and all of the globe. And but what I keep thinking about is that it's not really about the objects at the Met. It's about the ideas and the fact that the Met is filled with ideas and beginnings of conversations or questions rather than answers. And so because the Met has a unique position in New York, and we have a long way to go to invite more people from our community to the city. But I think of myself as the in-house specialist, discomfort specialist. So my job at the Metropolitan is to make people uncomfortable. And this discomfort really comes from my commitment to not really upending the balance of power, but sharing the power about interpreting what the Met means and what the objects mean, and bringing multiple voices of interpretation to the museum. The museum traditionally works in the power structure is we have the people who care for the objects and the people who interpret the objects and who understand the objects, and they tell the rest of us how it's going to be. And what I do is I say, well, yes, I understand that and I respect it, but there are other ways to look at this work and to other questions that you can ask coming from different perspectives. And so I invite artists to leave their comfort zone and leave the security of the theater and the proscenium stage, and to just take a walk with me in the museum and say what narratives what are you seeing, what are you not seeing? What narratives are not being told? Who are you not seeing here? And how would you tell their story? And how would you reconfigure your craft, whether it's dance or theater or music or performance, however you define it, time-based art, to work productively in the confines of a museum where, you know, God might be your lighting designer if you're in the American Wing atrium, or you can't control the comings and goings of the audience, or there are maybe acoustic challenges. How do you create a meaningful work of art that takes the ideas that are embedded in the galleries and bring new meaning to them, and start new dialogues? And so that's where I start. And artists often get extremely uncomfortable with that. They have to cede a lot of control, not just physical, logistical control, but also intellectual and control over the meaning. Curators are very uncomfortable with that. People who care for artworks are very uncomfortable with that. So I live in this wonderful nexus of friction and discomfort. And I think that it has actually moved the museum forward, both in the type of people who come and the type of engagement that we're seeing, the type of questions that are being asked, and ultimately, you know, the direction that the museum is going to go in.
Thank you for that. Is this thing still on?
Yes.
Okay, great. It fell. Kate, you have had a kind of long view of both art in public spaces and private art by way of your current role with Bloomberg Associates, but also your stellar, if I do say so myself, helming of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs. And so what would you say to those who might have fears around the relationship to free public art and private art, and the sort of fear that one might cannibalize the other?
I've never heard anyone say how much is enough when it comes to art. You know, people get anxious because they say there's not enough funding or there's not enough audience. I've never actually seen that happen. And I've certainly never seen artists self-regulate. Well, if Lynn's writing a play, I'm just not gonna. So, you know, I think that one of the challenges, particularly in the US, that the cultural sphere faces, there is often the case, particularly with public art initiatives in cities, why are we spending money on this? You know, it tends to get pushed into a kind of peripheral state because culture, unfortunately, is seen increasingly as elitist in a bad way, and that's something we can talk about if we want to. But as a result, there can be a pretty destructive conversation about who gets meaningful resources and who gets meaningful access, and ultimately how you define a public. I think when it, and you know, I think that rests on two suppositions. One is that the market ultimately will drive quality without understanding. I think what we're increasingly having to face is a realization of how markets get gamed all the time. But the second thing is that there's this sort of Enlightenment hangover around sort of linear logic at the expense of emotional logic. And what so many people have discussed today and yesterday, among the many things I was so struck by when Renzo Piano said the word beauty has been co-opted by cosmetics. I think the word creative has been co-opted by everybody. You can be a creative accountant, you can be a creative commodity trader, and God bless you, you can be. But there is a way that creativity in arts and culture has the ability to override a lot of apparent boundaries because it can do this thing that Deborah Spar was talking about that a number of people have referenced, which is create an experience that is sovereign to the individual having it, but put it in a collective environment. So for example, when I served in Mike Bloomberg's administration in New York, we did this big public art project called the Gates that Christo and Jean-Claude had been working on for 26 years. And one of the masterful things about their art practice, I think, has been to recognize that process is part of the art. It's not just the end use, it's how you get there. But one of the extraordinary things about that, aside from the incredible amount of abuse that people in government took in the course of trying to stage that in a good cause, because it was about talking to various publics about this strange thing that was going to invade their space. It was very ultimately constructive. But when it opened in 2005, it was the first time that New York City was a headliner in every form of media around the world about something that didn't have to do with September 11th, that didn't have to do with politics, that didn't even ultimately have to do with money, but it gave people a proxy for discussing something that was really important. So Stelios, this Habermas, references for you, but it was about creating a public realm. And so one of the projects that I now in philanthropy get to work on, which is also very much thanks to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, working with the mayor of Athens here, has created a public-private partnership called the Athens Partnership. One of the projects it's taking on is the commercial center of Athens, which has been deeply disinvested, problems with graffiti, problems with people parking cars on the streets, etc. And so far, 5 blocks have been pedestrianized through a combination of factors that very much features artistic practice. It's treatment for the street, pop-up art, different kinds of signage, different ways of working with individual property owners to figure out how they want to self-express and how they want to understand their ability to reach publics. And was touring it yesterday with some of my colleagues from the mayor's office, and the victory moment was a guy on a motorbike stopped at the boundaries of this space, got off, and walked his bike through it. So, that's the relationship of public to private, I think, always comes back to figuring out what desire is, and then is there an artistic creative strategy for really getting to people in a way that services what it is that they want, the dignity that they expect, how they want to create a community around themselves.
That idea of that approach, that holistic approach to thinking about a community and the art making as one, I think segues nicely into your work, Jamie, at ArtPlace America. You, by virtue of your role as the executive director, have traveled all over the country and the world, and you sort of get to see art making, I think, at its best in the context of the larger economic climate and in the larger socio-political climate of a community. And I'm wondering if you have formed opinions about what is a responsible way to go about this. How do we do this work responsibly? And what are some of the traps that individual artists, organizations, and municipalities fall into?
Sure, thanks. So the work that we invest in at ArtPlace is fundamentally about artists and non-artists coming together to do something. And that is one piece of artistic practice that is part of the spectrum of artistic practice in the United States. And we have colleagues at something called the Center for Performance and Civic Practice who talk about the ideal spectrum of artistic practice. And they essentially talk about three basic kinds of artistic practice. They talk about studio practice, social practice, and civic practice. And what changes when you sort of move along that continuum are the two factors of who decides and who executes, right? So in studio practice, an artist decides what she wants to do and she does it. She makes a picture, she writes a play, she creates a dance. In social practice, an artist decides what she wants to do, but she can't do it alone. She needs members of the community to join her. And in civic practice, an artist and a non-artist decide together what they want to do, and together they do it. And this was meant to describe an ideal arts ecosystem, but I think all of us in the art world are actually guilty of using it as a good, better, best rating, right? So those of us who sit on the studio practice end, I spent 10 years at the Museum of Modern Art, right? Those of us who sit in studio practice look at those poor, sad artists who have to work in community, and we're very upset that they can't be good artists, and that's why they're doing that work, right? That's not correct. And those of us who sit on the community end of the spectrum and point back at the studio practice artists are very sad at these poor, lonely people living in their ivory towers who've never read a newspaper or met anyone who's different from them, right? In reality, we need it all. We need Guernica, and we need the work that Theaster Gates is doing, right? We need all of that work together to be an ideal arts ecosystem. But one of the things that changes and is fundamentally different as you move along that is what's at stake, right? And when you begin doing work in a community like Reading, you're making a sort of moral compact with the residents of that community that we're in this together. And it could mean some really good things for the people of Reading to have our story told on Broadway, and it could be complicated, similar for the work that we're doing in other arenas. And what's interesting to me, particularly thinking about something like the field of medical research, is before we did something that sort of had human lives at stake, we would have an IRB, we would have an internal review board that sort of says, what are we going in to do? And are we aware of what could be the consequences of that? Are we happy with the risks that we're taking in order to do the work that we think we're going to be doing? And in art, the really great artists discover that moral framework organically. We live it, we ask questions, we know how to do it, but we often don't sort of go into the work asking those formal questions or saying, this is the ethical framework within which I'm operating, and here's when I know I've gone too far. And I've seen some really extraordinary things happen, and I've seen some really disastrous things happen when you know, that can go very wrong. And when it goes very wrong, there can be very real stakes. People can lose homes, people can be displaced from their communities, narratives can be fundamentally changed for the worse. So I think we need to start asking a set of ethical questions that accompany the aesthetic questions that we at a field are very good at asking.
I want to, we're doing pretty well. I have a ton of questions myself, but I do want to honor the questions that are coming in over the app. So this question speaks to our current making art in our current global political climate. Turbulent times make people, and occasionally artists, rather abuse the public space than use it. Is there something that can be done to save these spaces, or in the name of free expression, should nothing be done?
I mean, on behalf of folks who work in cities, there is, I think, an obligation to make space available to citizens in a way, you know, that's responsible and meaningful. I mean, one of the painful conversations that, you know, sometimes got way out of hand in New York was how many concerts can you have on the Great Lawn in Central Park because you squish the grass. And it is really costly to replant and grow back. And people want their grass, and they want to have a lot of concerts. So you have to start brokering that. I mean, one of the brilliant things that happened when Leslie Koch ran Governor's Island was there was another place that people could go have amazing concerts. So, you know, I think I would slice that question a little bit differently and make it more about free speech. Because, you know, depending on who's in control of the space, you have to be able to make it available to people. My using it shouldn't preclude your using it because I've destroyed it. But the question is, what is allowed to be on it, and how equitable is that decision-making process? And I think another way of slicing that is the difference between indoors and outdoors. Because there are outdoor public spaces that, again, I think carry certain kinds of responsibilities around public safety, and then there are indoor public spaces. I mean, one of the things when I worked for the city, we spent a huge amount of time investing in making sure that they were genuinely public spaces, like the lobby at the public theater. Spent a huge amount of tax money on fixing bathrooms. I mean, I was the queen of cultural plumbing. But that's genuinely a sign of respect and welcome to people. And you haven't lived until you've tried to put a baby changing table in the men's bathroom of, you know, a major cultural institution in New York City. But, you know, I think that's part of what this is about, is having a sense of responsibility to a public, but making sure that one decision doesn't automatically erase a subsequent one.
Yeah, it makes me think back to Leslie's opening remarks and that idea, the word she used, share. And the idea of sharing is embedded in public spaces. And when we think about art in public spaces, that invitation is also implicit. And I'm going back to the kind of artistic process and thinking about freedom of expression and the stakes and how all of those things come to bear in the idea of sharing art publicly. And I'm wondering, I guess any of you could take this, but I'm wondering, what was it? How does the type of art that we're talking about in a public space, if it's cinema versus theater or live performance inside of a museum, how does that impact, should that impact the way an audience engages with it? And I guess by that I mean, more specifically, how do those rules of engagement shift in the most generous version of we are now going to share art publicly?
Well, I think that I know that people bring a completely different set of expectations to a museum than they do if they are heading towards Lincoln Center. I think that there are a lot of barriers to entry to museums as well, but I think that audiences that go to opera houses or concert halls self-select in an even more rigorous way. And so the opportunity to present performance in a space where people's expectations are completely different. Okay, I'll give you an example. If a person, I hear people say all the time, I went to see this exhibition at the museum of whichever, and it was terrible and I hated it. It was a terrible exhibition. And I can't wait to go next month to see a different exhibition. But if someone gets themselves to a performance of, let's say, contemporary dance, and they don't get it, or they don't like it, or they don't connect with it, that's it. They will never, ever choose to pursue dance again. And so I feel like we, as the Metropolitan Museum of Art, we have a huge advantage and a huge opportunity that we're trying not to squander, of people coming in with a completely relaxed set of expectations about, how do you behave in an opera house? All of that is just gone. And so, for example, this summer, there's also, because we live in these intensely divisive and polarized times, we all have an obligation to challenge ourselves and challenge the artists and create platforms for the artists to talk about what's going on and be on the front lines with us, fighting for unity and sanity. And so we're creating a stage at the Met Breuer, our newest building this summer, and we're calling it Theater of the Resist. And we named it after the space, the theater, which we're creating in a gallery, of the resist being taking, riffing on an art-making practice where you create a medium that then allows you to create using negative space. So a little heady, but basically what it is a very fast-paced cabaret-style presentation of voices that are very much outside the cultural hegemony. So we have made sure that it's free with museum admission, so we're trying to eliminate as many of barriers to entry as possible, and we're working with the artists to make sure that they understand exactly what it means to bring their voice into this very different kind of space, a museum space, where at the same time we will also have video installations by artists that will be dealing with similar issues like David Hammonds and Arthur Jaffa. So we're trying to create a political and social and cultural dialogue within one building using video and performance, dance, music, and theater. And we are doing it in a very intense kind of way, 3 or 4 performances per night, every night, throughout the summer. And we'll see what happens. It's a huge undertaking. It's a big risk. It's, again, it puts me in my captain of discomfort position. And we'll see what happens.
Very briefly, to answer that question, one of the things that we borrowed from gamers in terms of rules of engagement is that they say, you ask your audience, what do they desire? And that's where we begin. So often we make assumptions about what our audiences want, but when we entered Reading, we thought, let's ask them first what they desire, and then meet them where they are.
Go ahead.
Oh, what I love about that is, so I don't think all art should be consumed publicly. And in the United States, the Walker Art Center recently had an issue where an artist, who's an extraordinary artist, decided to create a gallows where people are hanged that refers to a very painful piece of Native American history, to the execution of several Dakota leaders. And they decided, for some reason that I'm honestly curious about, to install that in a public space where anyone could wander upon it. And there wasn't a choice, and there wasn't the option to not participate in that work of art. And one of the things that's there are many devastating things about suicide, but one of the many devastating things about suicide is they often happen in epidemics, where if one person in a community commits suicide, several do. And so there was an issue where the community rose up and said, we actually don't want that piece of art in public because it's not meant to be stumbled upon. It can't be consumed without context. People need to have choice to engage by it. And so I think there's both the artistic choice, the curatorial choice, and the audience choice, and all together tells us what kind of art should be, to use Kate, your metaphor, what is outdoor art and what is inside art.
It's interesting. Go ahead, Stavros.
So, terribly sorry, but in a way you're commenting on the question we received from our audience earlier. What about failures? When you act in a public space, you're bound to make mistakes. There is no way you can avoid them. And the good thing about public spaces is that it's okay. There is, especially in the educational process, a failure is as valuable as a great success. As long as you contemplate on what has happened, rationalize the process, you can always gain something. And this is something extremely valuable that you gained from what you just described. So even in the educational process, having a failure there, talking about it, and then rationalizing the process, and trying to see whether it's actually the intentions or the way it was enforced, the way it was experienced, makes sense. And the other thing about public spaces is nothing is there forever. Each society has a right to reestablish its relationship to the public space. We are forced to. We can't avoid reestablishing how we connect to public spaces. So that's why the city is such a mobile, a wonderful thing, full of mobility and constant change. So sooner or later, what is now part of your daily life will become part of history. And I prefer to say part of the mythology of the city. Constantly restocking the myth of the city. We are actually sitting inside this wonderful brand new building, which will be an archaeological site in 1,000 years' time. So we're actually sitting on the ruins of the future. And we should always keep in mind that the city is in transit, it's a dynamic state. So this probably answers to what happens with things that go bad. Just wait, it's like the weather in certain countries, it will change. But there is great value in learning from these mistakes and from these failures.
But there is, your story, Jamie, seems like an example of, yes, maybe not a terribly well thought out engagement of public art, but I do wonder, we've been talking a lot about the highly polarized society we live in, and I think it was Stavros that asked the question very openly, why are we so alarmed by that? And what role can art play in helping us to grapple with that? So I do wonder, what is the balance with regards to public art? What is the balance between the art that seeks to bring us together and unify us, and the art that is designed to incite debate and it is designed to provoke opposing points of view coming together in a public way? How do we traverse that, especially given the stakes in our society today? And I was thinking, Konstantine, that you might have some thoughts on this, given where your work lives.
Yeah, I mean, I was also thinking about a number of things following on from the earlier discussions in your question. With regards to the question of temporality, I think how we're able to capture these moments and what they leave behind. I mean, I've been primarily looking at the use of art in protests and in very heightened states of tension. It's been interesting to see that art itself has been used as a way to appease protesters in some cases, where people concentrate in a creative process to produce other ways of expressing themselves. And in that regard, kind of shift the rules of the debate, but also through the art, they kind of start occupying the space and change its meaning. They change what it starts to symbolize. Like in Tahrir, it was in many ways the symbol of oppression for many people, took steps and steps until they would be able to occupy it. And art came at the sort of a later stage in order to stabilize the protest. It came as a way to start producing a language for what's happening. And the same when we look at Hong Kong and the protests there, we see art becoming the main, actually, way of voicing dissent, as opposed to a very strong I mean, it came to kind of give a unifying appearance to a very fragmented movement that included nationalists and libertarians, all the way to people who just want civic liberties and not the encroachment of China. That was kind of, art started providing a shared narrative through a shared set of symbols. And it's interesting to see that, in fact, a lot of artists now, because of the ephemerality of what was happening, because of all these things just happened and disappeared, you know, the boulevards that were occupied are now just functioning boulevards with buses and heavy traffic. You could forget that it ever happened. But artists are trying to work on an archive where they sort of collect everything that happened during those few days to give it a temporal depth, to give it a longer lifetime. And I guess maybe in terms of the medium that was chosen, but also how art can maybe unify, but also hide what actually may be a lot more complex situations, a lot more conflicting points of views.
I think, sort of from a transactional point of view, what interests me about this tension is understanding what an art project is trying to provoke. Because if it's just trying to provoke for the sake of provoking, that doesn't tend to go so good. If it's trying to provoke something that's really thoughtful, that can get people to a point where they agree to disagree, that is often, to me, the most valuable kind of artistic intervention. And I mean, one of the projects we started doing at Bloomberg Philanthropies, we call it the Public Art Challenge. We've offered US cities money to come up with a temporary public art project that addresses some kind of civic issue. So the Astor Gates Art House is part of what it's trying to figure out is in a city with 70,000 residents and only 30 restaurants left, how do you use art and culture to create a return to a civic life that is generative in terms of food? And the notion that food is an art form is still controversial in some areas. But we also funded a project in 3 cities in upstate New York that was about abandoned properties. And in 200 abandoned buildings across these 3 cities, a light treatment was installed that made it look like the houses were breathing light. And it was potentially really controversial because people in those cities were asking, why are you spending money on an art project rather than fixing these houses? Are you encouraging poverty tourism? How is this going to help? And the organizations that did this did, I think, a really extraordinary job. It meant land banks had to cooperate, it meant mayors had to cooperate, it meant financial institutions had to think about who was bankable, it meant that neighbors got to describe previous neighbors that they'd lived with who had to move away. So it ended up becoming a really dense exploration that will hopefully transform public policy in the area of abandoned property. So, it's very much trying to walk that balance of provoking people. How is it that we come to live in cities where we have blocks and blocks that have 3 or 4 empty houses that become locuses for drug dealing, for graffiti, for other, deeply undesirable elements, but we have become so tentative about strong interventions because we don't want to offend people, because it's hard, because we don't want to recognize that social services, rather than just a real estate transaction, are at stake here. How do you kind of shake that loose? And I think that's when artists and creative solutions are at their best, because they become a proxy for a lot of conversations about disagreement that are uncomfortable to have.
I think you've just answered the question that I was going to ask, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It came from the audience, and I want to kick it actually to both Jamie and Lynn. How important or non-important is the role of big cultural institutions in the public space, landscape, and life of a city? are not most of them mainly visited by tourists? So I'm interested to hear from an artist perspective, and then from a sort of institutional perspective.
Sure. I mean, it's an interesting question. And going back to Reading, Pennsylvania, they do not have any large cultural institutions in a city because they don't have the tax base to support them. And so I would say in the case of Reading, they're not that important because they do not exist.
Fair.
And I guess what I might add to it, especially since we're at a conference on philanthropy, is at least in the United States in the sort of 1940s and 1950s, the Ford Foundations and others really created a lot of the nonprofit cultural institutions that we know. And I think the impulse behind it was really great, right? Which was that sort of noblesse oblige that the provinces should have great art. And the way to do that was to sort of create these professionalized theaters. I think the unintended consequence of that is that as a society, at least in the United States, we only recognize the art that's mediated by those institutions as art. I grew up in a community very similar to Reading, not that far from Reading, and we would have said the same thing. Oh, we don't have artists, we don't have art, I don't go to stories, I don't go to dance. That was not true, right? That was inherently not true, but what we were saying is we don't have the Public Theater, we don't have Lincoln Center, we don't have the Met Museum. And I think pushing ourselves as a society to understand that full continuum of what art looks like, of what artists look like. And yes, we need the Met Museums, and we need you in conversation with that. Yes, we need great acknowledged playwrights and in conversation with that. And we need the sort of the hobbyist, the amateur, the popular art and culture that actually doesn't need nonprofit support. You know, more people listen to the music of Beyonce than anyone else, and she doesn't need an institution. She is an institution.
And can I add something to that? In terms of big public institutions, that I think a lot of artists are beginning to feel very stymied and stifled by the rules and regulations that the institutions are placing on them, and beginning to sort of stretch out and try to find other ways of creating without the limitations that are imposed by say, the Public Theater.
Limor, do you have anything you would like to add, being in one of those big institutions?
I think it goes every which way. It goes both ways. I think the Met is embracing more and more this notion of what are people doing now? What is contemporary art looking like? And you know, embracing performative practices, which have a different threshold to entry. They have, you know, there are different paths to becoming an established artist. And so I think that those dialogues are happening, not fast enough for me, of course, but they are happening.
In the couple of minutes that we have left, I've been, you know, obviously peppering you with questions, and they're coming from the audience. And my final question to all of you is, in the spirit of rigorous inquiry and exploration over the next few days, what are the big questions in your mind about the relationship of art to public spaces and or your own work? What are the things that are looming in your brains as you head into the rest of this conference or into your next project?
So I'll sort of tell a little bit of a bad story on myself, which is actually about the space that we're sitting in. And when I first started talking with Stelios and his colleagues at the foundation about this idea of building the sort of grand temple to art and culture, and to sort of, you know, bring in a great architect and just sort of build this and people will come, I sort of, you know, very haughtily said, oh, it's never going to work, right? You can do that, it's never going to work, it's not going to happen. And last year we came, they opened the gates, they handed out a little bit of free ice cream, they put some people with music in various places, and the place was flooded. And so one of the things that I'm very good at is I sort of have the haughty assurance of knowing how things should work and knowing the prescribed ways to do things, and I'm almost always wrong. So one of my big questions that going into this is how can I let go, how can I recognize the assumptions that I'm carrying with me that I don't even know I have? It's a question we ask a lot in our work. How do you help someone solve a problem they don't know they have? And I carry so many assumptions about how public space and art should intersect, and I'm trying to learn to recognize them and let go of them. So I'll start with that.
Yeah, I guess my big question is, how do you create art in places where it's underrepresented, in which you do not have institutional support?
Anyone else?
Well, actually for me, maybe building on my work and what I've been hearing today, we've been hearing some people say we need more conflict. I would come from a perspective where we might need a bit less. And I'm wondering whether, I guess my question and what kind of drives my work is what's the right kind of conflict we need and where do we need it to happen? And in some ways, I think at a time where institutions, the legitimacy of institutions is so fragilized, who's going to oversee all of this? What are our overarching sort of frameworks that enable this conflict to not go completely out of control? I would think, not sure what the place of art in that would be, but I think there's the question of being able to provide that language that is not necessarily uniting, but not divisive either. I don't know where the middle ground stands, but for me there's more of a search for middle ground and more conflict.
For me, the very important, crucial question is, which affects my job as well, is whether public spaces matter in the city of today, in the city of the future. If they do, we should keep on doing what we're doing. You are doing a wonderful job, by the way, inspiring people to come together and interact and produce the new public sphere of our times. But these places cannot substitute real democracy or true society. And in fact, they should be a vehicle, they should wave the flag for democratic participation, because that's what makes public spaces matter in the future, in the city of today and the city of the future.
How do I advocate for the value and the role of artists and art when it is often so hard to quantify the impact? And how do you create a greater appetite for understanding, for sympathy, for the kinds of extraordinary results, values, forms of democracy that get created specifically through the arts?
I would say, how do I continue to create the conditions that are needed for artists to take up their historical role as not just reactively commenting on our world, but actually leading with voices of democracy and return to discourse? And how can I create the environment for them to be able to take that step?
Awesome. Well, as soon as you guys answer those questions, we will all be better off for it. So good luck. And thank you so much for indulging us. And thank you for your questions.
Thank you all so much for being here. It was a long but very, very interesting first day. We hope to see you back again tomorrow and the day after.